My brothers and sisters, hear me today. You are not forgotten, you are not abandoned, and you are not alone. The same God who provided for Abraham, the same God who rained manna from heaven, the same God who fed Elijah with ravens, that same God is still on the throne. He is Jehovah Jireh. He is the Lord who provides, and if he did it before, he will do it again. I don't know what you're facing. I don't know what you're struggling with. I don't know what's keeping you up at night. But I came to tell you that God sees you. He sees the bills you don't know how to pay. He sees the doors that won't seem to open. He sees the job that won't call you back. He sees the medical report that shook your faith. He sees the child you've been praying for, and I declare over you today, God will provide. Provision is not just about money. Oh, no. It's about everything you need to fulfill the call of God on your life. He provides strength when you're weak. He provides peace when your mind is overwhelmed. He provides wisdom when you don't know what to do. He provides favor when you don't qualify. God's provision is not limited by your bank account, by your education, by your connections, because when God gets ready to bless you, no man can stop it. Some of you are standing at the edge of a miracle, but you're looking at your lack, you're looking at your limitations, and you're wondering, God, how? But I came to tell you today, faith is the currency of the kingdom. You don't receive by doubting, you don't receive by worrying, you don't receive by complaining, you receive by believing. God said if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move, and it shall be moved. The problem is not the size of your mountain. The problem is the size of your faith. When Abraham walked up that mountain with Isaac, he didn't know how God was going to provide, but he knew that he would. And when he got to the top, the provision was already waiting for him. Some of you are waiting for the breakthrough to show up before you believe, but faith says, I believe even when I can't see it. Faith says, I trust even when I don't understand. Faith says, I will step out even when the ground looks shaky. You see, faith is not tested in the good times. Faith is tested in the storm. Anybody can praise God when everything is going well. Anybody can trust him when the bills are paid. But can you trust him when you don't know how it's going to work out? Can you trust him when you're down to your last? Can you trust him when the door closes, when the opportunity passes, when the storm rages? That's where faith rises. That's where provision is released. Somebody needs to hear this today. God's provision is not coming from the direction you expect. Oh, you thought it would come through that job, that person, that connection. But God said, I am your source, and I can use anything to bless you. He sent ravens to feed Elijah in the wilderness. He used a widow with a handful of flour to sustain a prophet. He took 2 fish and 5 loaves and fed 5,000. God doesn't need much. He just needs your faith. And some of you have been stuck because you're waiting for everything to line up, waiting for all the pieces to fall into place, waiting for the perfect conditions. But faith moves before the miracle. Faith walks before the way is clear. Faith praises before the battle is over. God said, you don't have to see it to believe it. You just have to trust me. I came to tell somebody, stop worrying about how it's going to happen and start thanking God that it's already done. Stop doubting what he promised you and start preparing for what he's about to release. He is Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides. And I declare over you today, your season of lack is over. Your season of struggling is breaking. Your season of waiting is shifting. God is opening doors. God is making a way. God is turning it around. Lift up your hands, open up your mouth, and give him glory. God sees you right where you are. Before you ever cried out to him, before you ever felt the weight of your struggle, he already knew. He saw the bills piling up. He saw the opportunities that slipped through your fingers. He saw the nights you laid awake wondering how you were going to make it. And let me tell you something, he has already made provision for you. When Hagar was wandering in the wilderness, feeling abandoned, feeling forgotten, she thought she and her son were going to die, but God saw her. He opened her eyes, and suddenly there was a well of water waiting for her in the desert. God had already placed provision in her path, but she needed the revelation to see it. Some of you are walking past your provision because you're too focused on the problem. God is saying, look again, open your eyes. What you need is already there. He is the God who provided for Elijah when there was famine in the land. He sent ravens to feed him, sent a widow with just a handful of flour, and multiplied what little she had. He will use whatever he chooses to take care of you. Trust him. Faith is not a feeling, not a wish, not an emotion. It is the currency that moves heaven. In the natural world, you can't walk into a store and take what you want without paying. You need money. In the kingdom, you can't receive from God without faith. Faith is the exchange system that pulls supernatural provision into your life. When the woman with the issue of blood pressed through the crowd, she had no money, no influence, no resources, just faith. And Jesus said, your faith has made you whole. Not her status, not her connections, not her strength, her faith. Faith opens doors that money can't open. Faith moves mountains that power can't move. Faith gives access to the impossible. The enemy wants to keep you doubting, because as long as you doubt, you delay your provision. But when you start believing, when you start declaring, when you start stepping out on what God said, you activate a divine transaction. God said, ask and you shall receive. He didn't say stress. He didn't say worry. He didn't say figure it out. He said believe. Faith is the key, and when you use it, you will see heaven move on your behalf. God's provision is often waiting on the other side of your obedience. Abraham didn't see the ram caught in the thicket until he took Isaac up the mountain. The widow in Zarephath didn't see the miracle of the flour and oil multiplying until she obeyed the prophet's instruction to bake a cake first. Peter didn't experience walking on water until he stepped out of the boat. Provision is already set in place, but God is waiting for you to take the step of faith. Obedience is the evidence of trust. It says, God, I may not understand. I may not see the full picture, but I trust you enough to move anyway. Some of you are waiting for confirmation, waiting for a sign, waiting for everything to be perfect before you obey, but faith moves first. God told Israel to march around Jericho before the walls fell. He told the priests to step into the Jordan before the waters parted. He told Naaman to dip in the river before his healing manifested. Provision follows obedience. What has God asked you to do? Where is he calling you to trust him more? Your next level, your breakthrough, your provision, it's all connected to your willingness to obey his voice. Faith always moves before the miracle. Too often, people will want to see the results before they take the first step. But that's not how the kingdom works. God requires faith in action. When Jesus told the 10 lepers to go show themselves to the priest, they were still covered in disease. But as they walked, as they obeyed, as they moved, they were healed. Their miracle was in their movement. The enemy wants to paralyze you with fear, to make you think you have to wait for everything to align before you step out. But God says, move first, and I will show you my power. Peter didn't wait for the water to feel solid. He stepped out of the boat while the waves were still crashing. The Israelites didn't wait for the Red Sea to part before they moved forward. Moses stretched out his staff, and then the waters made way. Some of you have been waiting for a breakthrough, but God is waiting for your faith to activate it. Faith doesn't wait for the conditions to be perfect. Faith doesn't wait for the storm to pass. Faith moves forward, trusting that the miracle is already on the way. God's provision does not always come from the direction you expect. Too often, people limit their expectations to familiar sources, thinking that their help has to come from a paycheck, a person, or a particular opportunity. But God is not limited by earthly systems. He is the creator of everything, and he can use anything. Bless you. Elijah was fed by ravens in the wilderness. Birds that don't even share their food brought him bread and meat because God commanded them to. When the brook dried up, God didn't send him to a rich man's house. He sent him to a poor widow with barely enough for herself. But because God had already set the provision in motion, what she had was more than enough. The problem is not that God isn't providing. The problem is that people look in the wrong places. Provision might not come through the job you expected, the connection you relied on, or the method you had in mind. But if you keep your faith in God instead of in resources, you will see that he always makes a way. He can use anything and anyone to take care of his people. Your season of lack is over when you step into the flow of God's provision. The enemy wants you to believe that struggling is your permanent condition, that things will always be this way, that you will always be barely making it. But the devil is a liar. God has already declared abundance over his people. He promised to supply all your needs according to his riches and glory. He promised that you would be the head and not the tail, the lender and not the borrower, above and not beneath. When Israel was in the wilderness, they had just enough. When they crossed into the promised land, they stepped into overflow. Some of you have been living in survival mode, just trying to get by, but God is calling you to shift your mindset. He is not just a God of enough. He is the God of more than enough. The same God who multiplied the widow's oil, who turned water into wine, who took 2 fish and 5 loaves and fed thousands, that same God is able to take your little and make it much when you align with his promises, when you walk in faith, when you trust him completely. Lack has to leave. God has already set everything in motion for your provision. Before you ever faced the problem, before you ever cried out in desperation, before you even knew what you needed, God had already made a way. His provision is not something he has to figure out on the spot. It was established before the foundation of the world. He knew every battle you would face, every obstacle that would try to stand in your way, every storm that would attempt to shake your faith. And he already put everything in place to sustain you. The question is not whether God will provide. The question is whether you will trust him enough to receive it. Too often, people look at their circumstances instead of looking at their God. They let fear drown out their faith. Let doubt silence their confidence. Let worry override their trust. But faith is what unlocks the provision of God. Faith is what makes a way in the wilderness, what calls things that are not as though they were, what causes mountains to move. Faith is the difference between staying stuck in lack and stepping into divine abundance. Abraham had to trust that God would provide before he ever saw the ram in the bush. The Israelites had to trust that God would bring them into the promised land before they ever crossed the Jordan. Peter had to trust that the water would hold him before he ever stepped out of the boat. Every miracle, every breakthrough, every divine provision comes through the door of faith. The provision is there, but you must walk toward it. Some of you have been waiting for the situation to change before you believe. You've been waiting for the door to open before you prepare to walk through it. You've been waiting for the resources to show up before you move forward. But that's not faith. Faith moves before the answer appears. Faith praises before the battle is over. Faith sows before the harvest comes. Faith rejoices before the breakthrough is visible. God is saying, if you would trust me enough to move, you would see what I've already prepared for you. The enemy wants to keep you stuck in doubt because doubt delays destiny. As long as you question whether God will come through, as long as you hesitate to step out in obedience, you postpone the provision that is waiting for you. The moment you shift from fear to faith, the moment you decide to trust God completely, the moment you step out, even when you can't see the full picture, that is the moment when heaven releases what has been stored up for you. There is no lack in God. He is not running short on resources. He is not limited by economic conditions, by government policies, by job markets, by human expectations. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He commands the winds and the waves. He speaks, and things that do not exist come into being. He is not worried about how to provide for you. He is waiting for you to believe that he will. This is the season to shift your mindset. Stop thinking like a beggar when God has called you blessed. Stop expecting barely enough when God has declared more than enough. Stop speaking words of doubt when God has given you promises of abundance. If you change how you think, if you change how you speak, if you change how you believe, you will see the manifestation of God's provision like never before. Your season of struggle is not your final destination. The wilderness is not where you are meant to stay. God is leading you to a place of overflow, to a place of supernatural provision, to a place where his blessings chase you down and overtake you. The question is, will you trust him enough to follow him there? Will you step out in faith even when you don't see the full picture? Will you believe that he is Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides? He has already provided for you. He has already made a way. He has already set the miracle in motion. All that is left is for you to walk in faith and receive what has been prepared for you.